At the end, the best you can say is that my hotel saved about 4 hours worth of people. Take 4 hours away from 100 days, and you have an idea of just how little I was able to accomplish against the grand design. So some of you may be asking, like, who said this quote? Never heard of this before. His name is Paul Rousseau Beginner. We've had some people in this class talk about the Rwandan genocide, and you've kind of heard it from the point of like a military perspective, or from General Dallaire, who was in charge of the peacekeeping troops at that time. But you haven't really heard of the point from an actual civilian that was a part of the Rwandan genocide. So I'm kind of here to talk about that. Paul Rusesabagina is a man who was actually a hotel manager, one of the prestigious hotels, and which is in the heart of Rwanda. And he saved 1,268 Rwandan lives just because of the different skills that he had. He was just an average man, but he became extraordinary by first having, being of good moral character. He was also a very courageous man in a time of need. And he's ultimately stood up for what he believed in, even though others around him and the rest of the world was not. So Paul Rusesabagina, I'm just going to call him Paul because it's really hard to say his last name, Rusesabagina. But Paul, he wrote a book called An Ordinary Man. He kind of just summed up everything that he went through during that time. The Rwandan genocide happened on April 2nd. It started on April 2nd, 1994, and lasted for 100 days. And roughly about 800,000 Rwandans were killed or slaughtered during this time. There's two different groups in Rwanda. You have the Hutu and the Tutsi. And you can't really talk too much about the Rwandan genocide, at least the 1994 Rwandan genocide, unless you talk about its history first, the history of Rwanda. So in roughly the 1800s, Germans, like Europeans came, mostly Germans, to kind of like colonize the place, and input their own perspective of European life to the Rwandans. At that time, they say not too much changed during that time. They still let the king at that time, who was a Tutsi, still rule and impart his own ways. But around the 1900s, the Belgians came and they started to take control. They kind of pushed the Germans out, and I would say they started to manipulate mentally the minds of Hutu and Tutsi. So it was at this time that the big separation between Hutu and Tutsi kind of took effect, and they started seeing small differences physically, which really wasn't really differences, because they would say the Tutsi had maybe a little bit bigger nose and were a little bit taller than the Hutu. But it was known at that time that Hutu and Tutsi, honestly, they didn't have much of a difference. The main difference that the Belgians looked at were that the Tutsi usually were in power, so that at that time it was like a Tutsi king who continued, more Tutsi kings kept coming into play, as well as a lot of the Tutsis that were just commoners, they owned more land, or they owned more cattle or farming area. So they kind of, I guess, would say they had a little bit more, they were more middle class, I guess you could say. But Paul Rusesabagina definitely wanted to know that there was really no difference. They had the same kind of culture, they had the same kind of upbringing, the same kind of religion. I mean, even something as simple as the same kind of children's stories. So then in 1962, there was like a formal election that was held to see who's going to be the new president at that time. And just because of the mass, there was a lot more Hutu than Tutsi in the region. Hutu ended up coming into power, and the Tutsi ended up they fled towards Uganda and stayed there for about 40 years, so from 60s to the 90s. And like I said, the genocide started in 94. So Rusesabagina, he was a man that had a very strong foundation of good moral character from when he was a child. So he really looked up to his father and mother, but mostly his father, who was a Hutu, and his mother was a Tutsi. But his father always taught him to do the right thing. He always taught him to, no matter what everyone else is doing, you do this, or you hold up your own standards. he says in his book, Rwandans are expected to offer shelter to the distressed, no matter what the circumstances. I took this lesson as a gospel, and I grew up believing that everyone felt this way. So I would say this kind of led into him in the rest of his life, really, setting the foundation for who he was, a man of good moral character. And it kind of led to the successful path of becoming a manager at the Hotel Mille Collines, which is the name of the prestigious hotel that he was in charge of. So he was also a very courageous man in the time of need. So I would say that many of us have never really been through a genocide or something to that extreme of an effect. And at this time, neither had he. So no one can really say he was a man of moral courage until this time. But at this time, he definitely stepped up and it was very courageous. So right before the genocide started, it wasn't just out of nowhere, overnight, happening. There was definitely about a year worth of talk and build up to this point. So there's a radio station that broadcasted to all of Rwandans, and it started kind of manipulating. It was owned by Hutu, and it started manipulating many Hutu that listened that, hey, the Tutsis that are coming back into our land, coming back from Uganda and other places around there, they started telling them, like, hey, we don't want these people in power, and you need to do your job by, killing them or stuff like that. And right whenever the president, who was a Hutu, his plane was shot down. No one really knows exactly who shot the plane down. But whenever his plane was shot down, that's when Paul Rusesabagina knew that this genocide was about to start because of the buildup from mostly the radio broadcast. So at this time, he was hearing, right when it happened, he started hearing people were telling him, hey, your hotel, there's a lot of refugees trying to get to the hotel to stay there. And so he's like, okay, let me make my way towards the hotel. He, on the way there, he was caught, and he had his family as well. And pretty much they were just telling him that, hey, just because you're a moderate Tutu and we know that you're in charge of this fancy hotel, we're not going to kill you now, but we're going to actually kill your family, this and that. And the only way he was able to get out of it, he said, I was speechless. After 5 minutes, I started negotiating with them. After hours of dealing, they drove us to the hotel. I promised to give him money. So whenever he got out of this one situation, he knew that it took courage to stand up to many of the Hutu who were doing the killing at that time. And since he had really great negotiating skills, he started to use that to his advantage. So every day there was Hutu that came to the hotel. Obviously more and more refugees started coming to the hotel. And every day many people knew that, so they would come to the hotel and every day try to get something out of Paul Rusesabagina, or say, I'm going to come here and kill all of the refugees you have in the hotel. But it took a lot of more courage to stand up to these people, because he would negotiate with them every single day and use the food and the money that the hotel had, in storage at that time, and also liquor, things like that, and to try to negotiate with these people, like, hey, let's not do this today. How about I give you some money, I give you some food, have some liquor here. He also had connections to higher powers, and he used that as well to negotiate his way every day out of him being killed and everyone else he was trying to save. So like I said, this took a lot of courage. And then lastly, having the strong moral or good moral character, being of good moral character and being very courageous, it kind of led into him just ultimately standing up for what he believed in, no matter what anyone else was doing. So an argument can be made that the Hutu were also standing up for what they believed in, which was killing the Tutsi because they wanted to stay in power. They didn't want the many Tutsi back in their country. But obviously this is completely wrong. He stood up for what he believed in, no matter what his neighbors were doing. So we had moderate Hutus that were kind of converting to, okay, I'll help kill people if I can stay alive. He didn't resort to that. He stood up for what he ultimately believed in, which was going back to his good moral character foundation that his father gave him. Also, the world was not really standing up for what they believed in either. So at that time, I guess big powers that were in play here were France, Belgium, the United States, and just ultimately the United Nations. But they kind of just turned a blind eye. They seemed too preoccupied or at least they made it seem that they were preoccupied with their own self-interest and their own self-government, things going on in their own country. They definitely, word got out that, hey, this genocide is happening, we need help, or the Rwandans need help. But they kind of just said, oh, I have other things going on. It's not really a genocide. They didn't really want to call it that. They just called it was, you know, there was issues going on in Rwanda, but they didn't call it a full genocide, even though it was. And because they didn't call it a genocide, they didn't have to come to their aid at all, technically. An author who did some extensive research in this film, he says, or his name is Richter, he states, the French were obsessed with protecting a Francophone regime. The Belgians were obsessed with establishing a colonial legacy, ruling by divide and conquer tactics. The US government had been traumatized by the fiasco in Somalia and was preoccupied with Yugoslavia, and the US media was preoccupied with the O.J. Simpson trial. I mean, the O.J. Simpson trial, really? Like, that's very interesting if you think about it. I mean, it definitely doesn't stand up to a genocide that's happening. And there was no need for the US to have the belief or have the system of saying we will help another country during a genocide. And when a genocide is happening, they're not doing anything. Some could say that, you know, the Belgians kind of did stand up a little bit and help. They sent 2,700 peacekeeping troops to Belgium before the genocide officially started under General Dallaire. But they really didn't have any authority or say in the matter. They had weapons, but they couldn't use them unless someone was physically attacking them. But they couldn't help others with their weapons. So I wouldn't say that's standing up for what they believe in. But Paul Rusesabagina did. So in conclusion, some would argue that Paul, he was actually not a hero at all. You know, he was just a man that so happened to have a prestigious job and so happened to, just save his own life. That's really what his ultimate goal was, to save his own life. But although his life was ultimately saved, of course his life was saved while he was helping others, he ended up saving, like I said, 1,268 Rwandans. And he's kind of stood on the right side of the genocide, I would say. So he actually doesn't consider himself a hero. And just going back to the quote I said earlier, he said, how is, 4 hours worth of killing really doing anything, or saving lives that would have been killed really doing anything? But I would definitely argue that because of his moral character, and because he was courageous, and because he stood up for what he ultimately believed in and not really being wavered, saving over 1,200 lives, I mean, that's a huge accomplishment, and it definitely can't be overlooked. So he's definitely a hero in my eyes.